For many of us, retro gaming has become a cornerstone of our gaming lifestyle, and finding the best devices to play on, our mission. While many older consoles already offer high-quality video output, some even older platforms such as the Nintendo Entertainment System do not. RGB and HDMI mods have existed for a while, but what if you could buy a brand new system designed to play NES games as well as the original hardware, while also offering pristine analog and digital video output? That's precisely what the Analogue Nt Mini is all about. Today we're going to explore the Nt Mini hardware, its capabilities, and some of the bonus features on this episode of DF Retro. We're also going to explore some of the most technically impressive NES games while we're at it. So let's get started. Known for its contemporary take on retro hardware, the Nt Mini is Analogue's fourth original console. The Seattle-based company got its start with the consoleized Neo Geo built into a block of hard wood back in 2011, which was followed up with a slim revision the next year. In 2015, the long-awaited but often delayed Analogue Nt was released. The NT is a console housed within a block of machined aluminum designed to play NES and Famicom games. But as with the CMVS before it, these premium consoles were made in limited quantities. Due to a reliance on salvaged parts, these consoles ultimately proved unsustainable. But the Analogue Nt Mini is something entirely different. On the surface, the Mini looks rather similar. You get the same beautiful aluminum shell, only ever so slightly smaller. The cartridge slot now features rounded edges as well, designed to eliminate any chances of scratching your carts. The back of the unit then contains a set of new inputs and outputs in comparison to the original NT, and the console ships with a wireless 8-bit-do gamepad, the receiver of which can be used on a real NES or the original NT, of course. The transparent bottom remains just as with the original system, revealing the lovely motherboard housed within. And it's this board where the Nt Mini differs so greatly from the original. In creating the Nt Mini, the company took a different approach by contracting out the engineering talent of Kevin "Kevtris" Horton. Unlike its previous consoles, the Nt Mini is built using a field programmable gate array, or FPGA, which is basically a user programmable microchip with thousands of customizable gates. This chip can be programmed to perform any number of functions, including duplicating the functionality of another machine, such as the NES. Think of it as hardware-based emulation. This is different from most of the cheaper NES clones or Fami clones, which generally use an application-specific integrated circuit. The available ASIC chips used in these clone systems all fail to perfectly replicate the functionality of a real NES console, leading to errors or inaccuracies during gameplay, especially with the sound. There are also Android-based machines running on a system on a chip, including the less than stellar Retron 5, which rely entirely on software emulation, but these too have many limitations, especially for purists. In comparison, the FPGA used in the Nt Mini is designed with accuracy as a key objective. We tested a huge range of games, and everything we threw at the system worked without a hitch. In its current form, every single cartridge which I own works without any issues at all. And if you do run across any issues, Kevin has proven himself to be very quick with responding to those problems and updating the system. Now, one of the best features on the Mini is full support for both digital and analog video output. By default, the original NES and indeed most of the ASIC-based clones are actually limited to composite video output. So if you want RGB, you need to install a mod such as the NES RGB from Tim Worthington into an original NES console. Analog RGB output is important for those wanting to enjoy the NES on a CRT monitor with the highest quality picture, and getting there has never been cheap. Now, an HDMI mod was also released not long after this by Kevtris himself. The high-def NES, as it's called, is an add-in board that can be installed into a regular NES console, enabling HDMI output. This functionality was also available as an option for the original Analogue NT, but in both cases, installing the high-def NES eliminates support for analog RGB output. In comparison, the NT Mini offers HDMI output and support for all forms of analog video output, including RGB. The digital HDMI output then is crystal clear with sharp, bold pixels visible without any interference. As with the high-def NES mod, all of this is driven by an overlay system which allows you to adjust the picture and make various other changes. For starters, you can choose between 480p, 720p, and 1080p output at both 50 and 60 Hz. When going for that crisp look, we'd recommend 1080p, but if you want to use scan lines, the 720p mode actually seems to look best. What's interesting about the 1080p mode though is the ability to adjust the scaling value between a low of 4x all the way up to 5x. An NES image is comprised of 240 lines of resolution, and increasing that by 4x allows it to hit 960, which fits nicely within a 1080p canvas. 5x though pushes us up to 1200 lines, which exceeds 1080 of course, but since most NES games were designed with overscan in mind, you don't lose a lot of information. Now the original Analogue NT only supports 4x and 4.5x, so this is a welcome feature if you're looking for a larger, non-distorted picture. When using the 4x height mode, we recommend going for the 5x width to maintain proper pixel scaling. With the 5x height mode then, you'll want to use 6x width instead. Using actual 4x3 scaling values can actually introduce artifacts into the scrolling. As I mentioned in the NES Classic Mini review, it's not really recommended as a result of these problems. Now some 4K TVs, such as LG's OLED line, do allow you to freely scale and stretch the image without introducing noticeable artifacts, so it can be possible to fix the aspect ratio if you desire. One thing to keep in mind though is that the interpolation option has been removed from the Mini. This feature on the original NT allows you to slightly soften the image, which when combined with scan lines in 720p mode can create an image that more closely resembles what you might get on a CRT. Another neat feature available when using HDMI is the cropping option. Many NES games feature visible garbage along the sides of the image, something that could often be hidden by overscan on an older CRT. Cropping this allows you to hide parts of the image, eliminating the garbage in the process. Of course, sometimes this also removes important parts of the game image, like the gates here in Mega Man 3, but it will vary from game to game. There's also the scan line option here, and here we recommend using the original option, as the other available options do not line up properly with the pixel grid of an NES game. And as I mentioned earlier, if you do want to use scan lines, it's best to do so using the 720p output mode, since they seem to look best there. There are also several scaling options here, which basically act like filters you might find in an emulator. An interesting inclusion, but not really my cup of tea. Two additional options of use are the adjustable palettes and the number of sprites. Palettes exist in the high-def NES mod already and the Analogue NT, but we're limited to just a few choices. The Mini expands this to include a new set of palettes while also offering users the opportunity to install their own palettes using an SD card. The number of sprites option then refers to the NES's sprite limitation. In many games, when too many sprites are active on a certain line, you get flicker like this. By bumping this up to 16 from 8, however, the flicker can be completely eliminated. I've been using this option by default and have yet to run into any issues, but the option to toggle it is always useful just in case. That's a basic overview of the digital video output features on the system, but before we look at the analog video, it's time for the Digital Foundry Minute. If you've played some of the late generation NES games, you might have noticed that some of them include full parallax scrolling. I'm talking about 2D backgrounds which move more slowly than the foreground. 16-bit consoles supported this feature in hardware, but the 8-bit NES most certainly did not. You might have recognized this effect in games such as Battletoads. Or titles such as Swordmaster, which delivers a convincing parallax effect here in the forest area. Shatterhand is another great example, as is Vice Project Doom. Even Capcom gets in on the action with Mega Man 6. Each of these games features impressive scenes which resemble something you might expect on a 16-bit system. Now, NES games use background and foreground tiles which are combined into a single layer, while later consoles like the Super NES actually featured independent background layers. So, on the NES then you had to rely on programming tricks. You could modify when the background tiles were updated, giving the impression of parallax. The limitation to this technique is that the background tiles and foreground tiles could never intersect since they are technically part of one layer, which is why in scenes with parallax, the tiles are limited to the ground. The top and bottom are of course split. If you zoom in and look really closely at where the two almost intersect, you can see that there is only a pixel width difference between the parallax background and the gameplay foreground area in Vice Project Doom. The development team really pushed this trick to the limits. Some games, such as Batman Return of the Joker, attempt to work around this limitation by using animated tiles instead. There is no actual scrolling happening here, it's just cycling between different tiles. You'll notice that the clouds appear to be moving at just 30 frames per second, while the foreground is 60 frames per second. That's just a side effect of the trick. Was that more than a minute? Well, back to the show now. Okay, so how about analog video output then? The Mini does not ship with analog cables, but plenty of shops, such as Monoprice if you're in the US, sell what you need. The connector is a simple DE15, basically the same as a VGA port, and it can output composite, S-video, component video, and RGB. Here's a quick look at how they stack up. Let's start with Mega Man 3. In my setup, the S-video and composite video were both input into the FrameMeister directly, and I observed some slight rolling bar interference patterns when doing so. But your mileage may vary on this front. When comparing them all though, composite video is, of course, far and away the worst of the bunch, just as you would expect, with visible artifacts while moving. S-video definitely looks better, but it's still not up to par with component or RGB. You can buy this adapter to use one of the lower tier options. And while we're here, here's how composite video from the NT Mini compares against a real Nintendo running composite video as well. Quality is comparable, though the NES does not exhibit the rolling bar issue, which is likely related to the composite video adapter itself. This mode is likely best served for those using an old composite-only television. Component video is another one which I could test via the FrameMeister, and of course it looks rather crisp. Though my color adjustments were slightly off compared to the rest of the video, you can see the variation when looking at the sky here in Mario. I should mention that when using any of these analog cables, most of the menu options are disabled, so you can't adjust things like cropping, for instance. You'll have to rely on your display or scaler for that. If we jump over to the title screen here in Gimmick, we really see the benefits of stepping up your video quality. The slanted lines look absolutely terrible when using composite video, but are pretty sharp and clean elsewhere, even on S-video. So how about RGB? Well, if you want to use SCART, you'll need a different cable specifically for that, which you can buy at one of my favorite shops, Retro Gaming Cables. I've been using the BNC cable with my PVM monitor here, however, and the results are quite excellent, just as you would expect. The important thing is that the NT Mini is capable of all of these different forms of output. You might wonder, for instance, why composite video would be useful at all, but if you had an older TV without inputs such as S-video, it might be your only option, and it's rather authentic to boot. Between the analog and digital options then, the NT Mini is far and away the most versatile and fully featured NES on the market today. It caters to all possible use cases and does an excellent job while doing so. I also want to mention some of the sound options available. Sound emulation is very accurate overall and supports both digital and analog output. Unfortunately, I don't have a Famicom disk system to test with, so I can't see how the expansion audio sounds, but games with additional audio chips such as Gimmick or Akumaju Densetsu sound pretty good. Just keep in mind that you'll need to adjust the cartridge audio volume in order to hear the extra sound channels. Which, as an aside, is one of the coolest things about late NES games. A number of titles featured additional sound chips designed to enhance music and sound effects. Sunsoft is one of the best when it comes to producing amazing music on the NES, and many of its later games made use of those special chips. Gimmick is one of the best examples, with the Sunsoft 5B chip, a superset of the FME7 used in other games such as Batman Return of the Joker. Your typical NES soundtrack might sound kinda like this. But with extra hardware included in the cartridge, you can actually achieve much better results, such as this. Cool stuff, right? Now, Gimmick also received a Scandinavian release, and this version did not have the audio chip embedded due to lack of pins on the cartridge slot. As a result, the soundtrack was remixed to use the standard NES sound chip, and the difference is pretty significant. And the Analogue Nt Mini does a great job handling all of these soundtracks. Beyond that, there are some audio options you can play around with, including panning the sound around to the left or right for a fake stereo effect, or simply toying with the way sound is produced, which can lead to some interesting results. Yeah. There's even an NSF player built right into the system if you just want to listen to the soundtracks without playing the game. So obviously playing NES games on the NT Mini is a big deal and the primary purpose of this system. But unlike the original NT, the Mini offers something unexpected. Kevtris has released Jailbroken firmware for the NT Mini, which greatly increases the capabilities. According to Kevin, the system is completely unbrickable due to the way the firmware is loaded, and while Analogue itself doesn't actually support this firmware, it will honor the warranty even when using it. You could kind of think of this as official unofficial firmware. So simply drop the firmware on an SD card, stick it into the machine, and away you go. But just what does this offer? Well, for one thing, there is the expanded NES support. You can now load ROMs directly from the SD card if you want, or rip your own cartridges using the Copy NES function, useful for preservation of actual game cartridges. Simply pop your cartridge in and run through the Copy NES process, and you'll end up with a ROM which you can name as you like. From there, you simply load it up, and you're good to go. Of course, hundreds of mappers are supported using the NES core, and it works just as you would expect. But the best feature? Well, see for yourself. Essentially, this FPGA is capable of playing games from a multitude of other 8-bit systems, including the Sega Master System, the Game Gear, ColecoVision, Game Boy Color, and the Atari 2600. The amazing thing is that we now have a fully RGB and HDMI capable version of these 8-bit systems. I've been looking for an easy way to enjoy Game Gear games on a TV for years now, with most mods being rather expensive and uncommon, but the NT Mini finally opens the doors wide open. There is even the promise of potential cartridge adapters being made available in the future, making it possible to use real carts. Okay, so while we're here, I wanted to look at a few interesting Game Boy related things. For one thing, parallax scrolling. I discussed it earlier in regards to NES games, but the developers pulled this off on Game Boy as well, just not as often. This second stage you're seeing here from Battletoads, for instance, features a really nice looking background. While perhaps one of the most impressive looking games out there is Speedy Gonzales. Yeah, the frame rate is rather low for a Game Boy game, but man, look at those backgrounds and the curves and the loop and the speed. Seriously impressive stuff. You can see why this served as a basis for Sonic fan games on Game Boy. Oh, and slopes weren't very common on Game Boy, with most games focusing on 90-degree angles, with more simplistic tile sets likely to save on memory. Some games, however, manage to pull it off. Trip World is one of those games, as is Battletoads. Another interesting trend on the Game Boy was 16-bit ports. Look at this, Factor 5 ported Contra 3 The Alien Wars to the Game Boy. This conversion is surprisingly faithful in terms of gameplay and even uses light parallax scrolling for the cloud layer here. Compared to the SNES version, of course, well, it's a massive step back, but considering the hardware difference, Factor 5 did an excellent job here. And what about Earthworm Jim? This is a larger downgrade, but it's kind of crazy to see this on the Game Boy at all, since the visuals really go against what the system was designed to display. It's a pretty neat conversion. Oh, but the ultimate comparison? Shaq Fu on Game Boy versus Game Gear. Whoever wins, we lose. Or how about this? Atari 2600 versus the Xbox. Halo versus Halo. I could go on and on, but the point is you can enjoy all of this and more on an Analogue Nt Mini, without resorting to cheap clone hardware or emulation. It's pretty amazing. Ultimately, after spending weeks with the NT Mini, I've walked away pretty impressed. This is a fantastic system that offers both excellent build quality and, most importantly, a huge range of functionality. The core functionality, playing NES games at the highest levels of fidelity, is a huge draw already. If you factor all of these functions here into a modded NES system, the price really goes up. You'd be looking at over $100 for an HDMI or RGB mod, more than that for an SD card based flash card such as the EverDrive N8, which goes for $118, and of course you'd need an original NES console, which isn't that cheap these days either. When you combine all of that together, you're looking at a price north of $300 at a minimum, and that's assuming you do the mod work yourself. If you want a fully assembled RGB or HDMI capable unit pre-modded and an EverDrive, you wouldn't be that far off from the $450 asking price of the NT Mini. When you consider the additional systems supported by the Mini then, as well as its ability to output both analog and digital video, it's a pretty good deal, I think. Of course, this is still a premium product targeting retro enthusiasts, and there are many other ways to play NES games, but for my money, this is one of the best consoles you can buy today. Anyways, we've reached the end of this episode. If you found it useful, be sure to like, subscribe, and follow us on Twitter. And until next time, stay retro.